You know, generally speaking, we think of a game of Magic the Gathering as mechanical pieces sitting on a board and doing their thing. And I mean, that's what it is, right? Like, that's really all that's technically going on, but there is a narrative that's constructed through a game of Magic that I don't think people really talk about all that often. In fact, actually, I've really only heard this talked about even at all on the Distraction Makers podcast, and their concerns for Magic are largely about broad concepts in game design and less about how individual cards feel to play and the individual community dramas that define a lot of what this game is for many of us. And I'm not exactly talking about the Magic the Gathering story, as it were, though sometimes the thematic thoroughfare from the story actually does lend itself very well to how games are played. A good example of this would be Valgavoth, right? Valgavoth, Herrer of Souls, is effectively the main villain of Duskmourn, and the entire point is everybody is trapped in a haunted house that has tons and tons of ways to fuck with your life. As it turns out, an actual Valgavoth deck ends up operating in this exact way, where the only way that the three other players at the table can enjoy a decent game of Magic the Gathering is after freeing themselves from the confines of Valgavoth, as he sits on the board wiping out your resources, making sure that playing cards is detrimental to you, and even bringing lieutenants to bear that can punish you for trying to do anything whatsoever. And there's even backups in Save the Precon that just supplement this strategy so much by turning people against each other. One player's high-costed spell ends up leading to another player seeking retribution, sometimes not against the Valgavoth player, but in a twisted Saw-like sense against their fellow teammate, somebody they should be operating against the Valgavoth player with. Which is a perfect way to illustrate how he operates in the Magic the Gathering story, where people do feel like there's this sense of hopelessness, and sometimes turning on each other is better than trying to deal with the giant moth demon. And this is one of those instances where, yes, the story of Magic the Gathering and the actual mechanics of the game create the same story in a commander format, but there's other instances of this as well that I've seen recently. Some of these are stories of my own construction, but I want to talk about them nonetheless because I think the way that we look at these things can really help change how we build our decks. As an example, my Sauron Lord of the Rings deck, or the Oops All Lieutenants deck that I've been playing recently, and that I've talked about on this channel, has a fairly compelling story for me. It's the story of a villain who looms in the distance, and no matter how much the other three people at the table want to quarrel amongst themselves, once the villain has made themselves known, everybody has to turn aside from their own differences and deal with the villain. And the way that the deck that I created makes this happen is with an extensive draw package to guarantee that it hits all of the important pieces it needs as fast as possible, and making sure that the actual lieutenants that come to the aid of the main villain of the table, like Jin-Gitaxias and Valgavoth and Nicol Bolas, are all incredibly powerful threats that must be dealt with by the table, and if they don't, then the game is effectively over. Leaving a Jin-Gitaxias on the board, or letting a Valgavoth steal all of your options, or letting a Sheoldred flip and taking everybody's graveyards, these are all compelling reasons to gang up on this character, this villain. And when we build this as a standard Reanimator set, we don't get that same narrative thoroughfare, but suddenly the deck works more mechanically cohesively when we build it with this story in mind. The story of a villain lying in wait, waiting for everybody to realize that their machinations are almost coming to fruition, and if nobody at the table is willing to deal with them, then that's it. Game over. It's a lot different from how, say, Valgavoth wants to function, where Valgavoth wants to be the presence that everybody is trapped in. People are slowly eroded and slowly turned against each other in a match with Valgavoth until usually he ends up reigning victorious, whereas a deck like Sauron is trying to loom in the distance, be away from everybody, be away from all of the combat, and only come when their schemes are finally pulled through. Or let's say you're playing a commander like Galea. What kind of a story does this commander give for you? There's a few different stories that this commander can tell. One is of a basically a clairvoyant knight, a paladin who's given a bit of foresight divinely and is using that to their advantage so that they can survive in a battle royale, because that's really what a game of Commander is. Or you can even have it as leaning further into the battle royale mechanics and less into the clairvoyancy of Galea. Galea needs to be suited up with the best equipment possible, the best ways to fight against everybody, and each and every piece of gear that is strapped onto Galea is powering her up more and more, and in a compounding way, making her a far more efficient paladin. This is more of a story of a one-woman army, and that's how I built my Galea deck when I put her together. The idea was having a one-woman army that can stand tall against basically anybody unless you strip them of their gear. And once you strip them of that, like any MMO character, what's really left? Once I take away everything that you've built up on your character is nothing. Unlike characters like Valgavoth that have small machinations that are constantly eating into you, this is just the story of one RPG character gaining as much power as possible to one-shot a boss speedrun style. And there's a lot of compelling stories that come from that kind of gameplay. It's the feeling of getting yourself to a position where you can do what you need very, very quickly, and if somebody knocks out all your gear, then you're resetting that. A lot like playing a game of Diablo and having a new season start where you have to start from scratch. Playing an equipment and aura completely centric version of Galea feels a lot like these kind of game mechanics, where the season resets everything you have, but you're still enjoying the time you're playing. Or even say Sephiroth, one of my favorite commanders of all time. What story does a deck like Sephiroth tell? Well, she's a much smaller and less imposing necromancer compared to what Sauron brings to the table. And she can reanimate creatures far more quickly than Sauron, which leads to you being able to play far more small creatures like White Plume Adventurer and Nadar and bring them back from the grave instead of the larger, more threatening lieutenants that Sauron has to rely on. This creates a very different story, and it's one that I actually really wanted to have shown in an artwork that I had commissioned for my channel ages ago. For a deck like Sephiroth, the idea that I had was a commander that is constantly pulling up bits and pieces of an undead army to protect themselves. And hell, for my own character, the idea was using slime for necromancy instead of actually using real necromancy as just a flavor thing. But the idea is still there. A necromancer that's able to quickly get a corpse up and then let it die very quickly so that the commander is able to stick around. Whereas Sauron is a flavor of necromancer that schemes and waits in the whims and then finally brings out one powerful mega boss that everybody needs to deal with, a commander like Sephiroth is instead building a small army and trying to amass that while staying in the thick of things. And again, even though these can create arch-enemy situations, they are still very different from a commander like Valgavoth, whose story is one of constant psychological manipulation and entrapment. I think way too often when we're playing games of Commander, we think of the games in terms of raw mechanics. That player's playing a Storm deck. That player's playing a Reanimation deck. That player over there is playing a Voltron deck. And the only stories that we think of that come out of those games are the stories that we make just with our friends. Bob over there managed to get his Kalia of the Vast on the board, and the Master of Cruelties hit me in the face, and it hurt. ouch. And that's as far as we go. I think the game, as much as I enjoy it mechanically, is far more fascinating in Commander when we look at these more as campaigns, as stories, with villains, and even sometimes villains of the week, and shonen antagonists that end up changing their tune halfway through a game. Like, again, going back to the Sauron example, the Sauron deck's entire game plan is putting up the main villain everybody needs to deal with. So how about the narrative of a bunch of minor shonen characters fighting each other and finally having to gang up on the big bad to win, and only afterwards are they able to go off and have a fun tournament together where they have a much more sportsmanlike game. That's something that I find personally compelling, and if you build your decks in order to facilitate these kinds of situations, I think you're going to end up finding far more interesting game plans than just, I'm playing aristocrats today, or I'm playing aggro today. I think trying to build these game scenarios as scenarios lends so much more to the flavor of this game that really uniquely doesn't exist in many other games. It may be a one-on-one game, but one of the few examples of this thematic thoroughfare that I'm so fascinated with actually existed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Years ago. If you ever remember playing Yu-Gi-Oh! And playing Noble Knights, if you happen to be around when they were a pseudo-meta pick, one of the big creatures of the deck was Sacred Noble Knight Artorias, who's basically King Arthur. That's his job in terms of Yu-Gi-Oh! Lores. He is the King Arthur of Yu-Gi-Oh! And his effect put a bunch of Noble Arms equip spells from the graveyard onto him. This suited him up a lot like Galea, but uniquely in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the way that you strip a creature of all of its equipment spells is by putting it face down. This created a wonderful narrative for the Noble Knights deck, where King Arthur could only be stripped of his power if you could get him to bow down. By making him bend the knee and go face down, you can beat the Noble Knights deck. And honestly, it's far rarer in a lot of cases that this thematic story is printed into cards as often as I'd like it to be. So uniquely, with Commander, we don't have to have this kind of story printed on our actual cardboard, like it was in Yu-Gi-Oh! For King Arthur, as cool as it was. Sometimes in Magic, the way we construct our decks just lend themselves to these stories. So I just wanted to throw this out there as something for people to think about. What kind of a story is your deck trying to tell? And if your deck isn't telling a story, why not? That said, let me know what y'all think in the comment section below. This is more shower thoughts than anything on my part, and I figured it'd be fun to do something a little different besides a deck tech on here. I wanted to know what these kinds of thoughts meant to you. If you enjoyed this style of video and you want to see more of it, then hey, let me know. Something a little different than a super mechanical breakdown of the game, and something closer and more akin to just musings on something that we all mutually love. Anyways, if you like my work, maybe support me on Patreon, and maybe give me a like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification icon. That said, as always, I don't have much more to say here, so insert into the video tagline here. Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Briskreek, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Mark Anthony, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that, Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fireshard. And everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full-time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full-time, and with your help, I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.